But the problem is it's at the end of Judges 9, or at the end of Judges, and Judges, those last two chapters, you can't really read them in church because, well, read them sometime and then you'll know. So anyway, we're in the middle of this series now. So last Sunday we did money, and this Sunday we're doing nationalism, and next Sunday my friend Rebecca is doing patriarchy on Valentine's Day, because like what else would you talk about on Valentine's Day? And these sort of fit together just as big topics, but biblically they're very different to think about and to deal with. Money in a lot of ways is the easy one, because the Bible talks a lot about money very directly, and it offers to us solutions that still make sense in our context. So I got the easy one last week. Next week, when Rebecca does patriarchy, that one is going to be complicated because the Bible is mostly pro-patriarchy. And so how she's going to deal with that, well, I'm looking forward to it. But the reality is also that the Bible is mostly pro-slavery. And we think about that in different ways too. So it's not like, we never ever disagree with biblical perspective places. And this week is nationalism, and nationalism is tricky because the Bible has no concept of nation. The whole notion of a nation state is a modern concept. And the Bible thinks about tribalism, but that's very different. We're going to get there. But as the Bible thinks about tribalism, it's also helpful to understand that tribalism hasn't gone away, that we as peoples today are still tribal. So for example, Mennonites are very tribal people. And we know that here because most of you here this morning don't think of yourselves as Mennonites, even though you are, right? Insofar as you are part of a Mennonite church, and we are a Mennonite church and the Church of the Brethren, you are all Mennonites and you don't think of yourselves as that. Partly because I think you understand exactly how tribal the Mennonites are, but that's my tradition, right? So I understand the Mennonite tribe, but part of being part of the Mennonite tribe is being anti-national in a lot of ways, and we're anti-national historically because of experience, right? The sort of the Mennonite joke might be, hey, I've been kicked out of better nations than this, right? So it tends not to endear you toward nationalism. So we live in a time in which we have these two systems operating in parallel. We've got the ongoing tribalism, that is just part of our society, and nationalism, and these two things ap or not, depending on exactly how it works for you. So we're trying to think about nationalism this morning without good biblical sort of words about it. The best example, the best parallel in the Bible might be empire, because the Bible lives in a time of empire. But the Bible tends to be very careful around the idea of empire, because for most of history of the time of the writing of the Bible, the Jewish people and the early church lived in a time when they were part of an empire, but they weren't on the right side of empire. And so it often wasn't safe just exactly they thought about the empire. But it's also true that those who were in power in Israel had learned to live with empire, even though it wasn't true for the good of the nation as a whole, but it worked for them. So it's sort of tricky. So nationalism, we need to think about nationalism. And I thought one way to do that, so I'm going to illustrate it by sharing my screen. Right, so there we are. Let's see if I can do all of this. Okay. So there we are in the United States of America. There's a little heart there. That's us right now. See, there's me. There's Canada, Mexico, and all these other places that aren't part of us. So I thought one way to illustrate that would be to zoom in a bit. Right, so here we are zooming in a little bit, right? So, right, there's where my parents live in Winnipeg. Deb's mom lives about here, right? But all this down here is part of us, right, in terms of being in America. So if we zoom in a little bit further, right, to the Saskatchewan, North Dakota border, we get to the little towns of Portal and North Portal. There they are. And nationalism tells us that Portal is part of us and North Portal isn't. Now, in case you're curious here, the population of Portal is 147, okay? And North Portal is smaller, but it has a golf course, so it's like way better, right? But nationalism tells us that Portal is part of us and North Portal isn't, right? Now, partly this is true, right? So if you went to Portal and talked about health, we'd be talking the same language, right? You'd be talking about insurance coverage and deductibles and co-pays and things like that. People of Portal would understand that. If you crossed the border and went into North Portal, people would look at you funny and go like, what's a co-pay? Like, and how do you have deductibles? What does that mean, right? And this has consequences. Because currently, right, there's COVID in both places, but COVID deaths in North Dakota are 1,400. COVID deaths in Saskatchewan are 300, despite the fact that Saskatchewan has a higher population and has more large cities, right? So these are things that actually matter, right? Or if you went to these places and you talked about militarism, you'd get probably quite different responses, right? So Portal is in North Dakota. I don't know what the current situation is, but when I was growing up, if North Dakota had seceded from the Union, it would have become the world's third largest nuclear power, right? Because there are so many missiles in North Dakota aimed at the Russians. And there are no missiles in Saskatchewan, as far as I know, but there are numerous uranium mines, right? So we have a different understanding, right, of military and nuclear things, right? So, right, and of course, the biggest difference between Portal and North Portal border, only Deb and I could actually go to North Portal, right? And the rest of you would get stopped at the border and sent home, right? So there's a very real sense in which nationalism matters. On the other hand, the average farmer, right, living around here and living around here have way more in common with each other than they do with any of us, right? Because a prairie farmer is a prairie farmer is a prairie farmer in a lot of ways, and they're not a West Virginia farmer or a West Virginia university professor, right? Or whatever it is the rest of us are doing, right? So there's a sense in which nationalism is talking about real things, and there's a sense in which it isn't. Okay, so here we are back again. Hang on here. Right, so we are currently, as a nation, at a very odd place, right? And we're at this odd place. So I was listening to a podcast earlier this week. It was on NAACP Facebook Live event. And Dr. Jerry Carr, who's the local head of the NAACP, was interviewing Dr. Jeremiah Hayanga of the WVU Heart and Vascular Institute. And they were talking about COVID stuff and how this was all going. And so Dr. Carr asked the question, so how do you get people to take the vaccine even when they're suspicious, even when they're hesitant, even though they're not sure? And Dr. Hayanga said, well, that's not really the question, right? How do you get people to take the vaccine? The real question is, how do you teach love? Which I thought was it blew me away. What an interesting question. How do you teach love, right? And how do you teach trust? Specifically trust in leadership. Because if you trust your leaders and the leaders say, go get a vaccine, you'll go get a vaccine. But trust is huge right now. Currently in this country, there is way more trust of corporate CEOs than politicians, right? The gap is not small at all. And that's scary, right? To think that most people trust Elon Musk more than they trust the president of the United States is a huge thing, right? And it's not surprising at all. The last 4 years, the foundation of the presidency has been all about trust and it hasn't gone well for some of us, um, right? And so, right, or we don't have to even, worry about President Trump. Really the last 200 years of West Virginia history um, have not engendered a lot of trust in politicians, right? And so we have this problem right now of fundamental trust in our political leaders. And well, we could go tribal and say, well, let's just stick to being a church, and that's okay. But currently our trust in church administration and church leadership isn't much better, right? I mean, the largest single group in the United States is called the evangelicals, and the evangelical leaders in the last 4 years, it's been horrible, right? And so, well, let's go to the next biggest group, the Catholic Church, right? Well, and the Catholic leaders have been defending child molesters and hiding child molesters for the last who knows how many years. So that's a bit scary. And even if we just stay in our own little group here, the Mennonites and the Brethren, right? When you listen to our leaders on a variety of issues and see their actions, it's better, but it's, wow, right? And all of these churches are facing declining numbers, declining revenues, and declining loyalty, right? So we have a trust crisis right now, and for good reason. There's a good reason we're having a trust crisis right now, but it's a big thing. And so here's where we're going to drop into Judges very briefly, because like I said, the last 3 chapters of Judges really need a trigger warning, right? If you're triggered by anything, don't read the last 3 chapters of Judges. But it's sort of Israel, everything in Israel falling apart. And everything in Israel falling apart, according to at least this last verse, is because it doesn't have strong central leadership. There was no king in Israel. Everybody just did what they felt like it. Right? So there's this call in the Bible towards central leadership, even as there's this warning in the Bible, right? Because, for us, right, okay, we don't have trust in our central leadership, therefore we need to, regain trust, and we need to have strong central leadership. But we see at the same time in our country the opposite threat, tyranny, right, which is threatening to upset the current oligarchy, right? So, right, there's our trust issue. So in the end, in a lot of ways, we are left to contemplate what it means when Paul says that our true citizenship is in heaven. And we could go into some background there, but it's important also to understand that what it might mean for us is very different than what it would have meant for the folks in Philippi, right? Not West Virginia, right? But it's still a good word for us to think about what that means. Right? We are part of this nation and not at the same time, because we have a higher loyalty to justice and to love and to God. So in a few hours from now, right, there's going to be a Super Bowl, in case you hadn't heard, right? And there's going to be it's a football game, right? But there's going to be lots and lots of nationalism there. And in the Super Bowl right now, and football right now, nationalism is always paired with militarism, right? Those two are put together. And so they're going to talk a lot about service to our country. And in this language, service to our country is equivalent to your willingness to kill and to be killed. And they always, of course, talk about willingness to be killed rather than willingness to kill, but those two are the same. And we can't pretend that this language doesn't exist in the Bible, right? Axel just read it, Psalm 110, right? Strong kingship equals strong military. It's right there in Psalm 110. But Jesus provides us alternative language. There's a reason this is a church. Jesus provides us alternative language to think about what it means to be willing to be killed, but not willing to kill. Wow, that's a lot, I know. My assumption here, for those of you who don't know, is that you are all going to do your own thinking about this. And you're going to do this whether I want you to or not. but I want you to do that. And it's something we need to keep thinking about as a church and as individuals because of the crisis of trust, and also because of the militarism of the nation we live in. So that's the challenge we have. It's not going to go away. We need to keep thinking about it. But we can also sing about it. So that's our next song. This land is your land. This land is my land. This is the American version, not the Canadian version. I don't know which version I'm going to sing, but we're going to do the Avett Brothers this morning. Philip, can you toss that up?